What is up, YouTube? It's your girl Evelyn, and I am back with the Season 1 recap of Dickinson. And yes, I will be spoiling the season in its entirety, so proceed with caution. Emily is a death-obsessed, overly dramatic, and just plain weird young woman who lives with her well-off family in 18th century Massachusetts. Emily casually dates death, dodges marriage proposals, has an affair with her brother's fiancé, and, of course, writes poems. Sue is Emily's best friend and is dating Austin, Emily's older brother. After Sue's last living relative dies, she moves into the Dickinson house and eventually into Emily's bed. Next up is Good Guy George, Emily's close friend and wannabe baby daddy. The last Dickinson sibling is Emily's flighty little sister Lavinia, whose only wish in life is to find a husband. Emily's dad, Edward, is a very traditional guy who disapproves of her writing. Emily's mother, also named Emily, is a doting housewife who encourages Emily to settle down and find a husband. Last but not least is Death himself, Emily's constant confidant, sometimes suitor, and unequaled obsession. Emily's mother is on a mission to transform her lazy, indulgent daughter into a proper young lady by finding her a husband. Mama D invites countless suitors to the home in hopes of snaring Emily a husband, but Emily isn't the least bit interested. All she wants is to be a great writer and to be left alone. Emily's buddy George is the editor of Amherst College's literary magazine, and Emily asks him to publish one of her poems, despite her father's disapproval. Emily and her father have a complicated relationship. He adores her and dotes on her, but he's also very firm about a woman's place in society, and Emily, craving independence, rebels against him at every turn. When Emily tells her father one of her poems will be published in the magazine, he flies off the handle. Edward's about to run for Congress, and he won't tolerate Emily's blatant disrespect, saying, "This foolishness of yours, we will have no more of it. You will tend to your duties as your mother does." Later, Edward admits how afraid he is of losing Emily, and makes her promise she'll never get married and leave him. Then he lies beside her in her tiny bed and goes to sleep. To make matters worse, Sue, the light of Emily's world and her favorite gal pal, has agreed to marry Austin, Emily's mostly harmless but still kind of annoying older brother. Emily is gutted. She doesn't believe Sue loves Austin, and more importantly, Emily herself is madly in love with Sue. The two best buds sneak off to an apple orchard, and Sue explains to Emily why she has no choice. She's a woman as well as an orphan in 18th century America, and her options are slim. If she doesn't marry Austin, she will literally starve to death. But Sue assures Emily she will never love Austin as much as she loves her. Then they kiss. Emily also has a date with Death this episode. They talk about her poetry, and Death assures her she will be the only Dickinson anyone remembers 200 years from now. A lecturer is coming to Amherst College to give a talk about volcanoes. Emily desperately wants to go, but women aren't allowed to attend. Their father instead encourages Austin to go, but he's like, that shit sounds boring. Emily decides to disguise herself as a man to attend the lecture and convinces Sue to join her. At the college, George immediately spots her because he's literally Pepe Le Pew and can sniff out Emily in a crowd of 100. Halfway through the lecture, Emily's flair for the dramatic comes out and she whips off her hat, giving herself away. When her father hears of the subterfuge, he's outraged. He gives her a copy of his essay entitled On the Proper Place of Women. Spoiler alert, it's in the kitchen. Emily refuses to read the essay, but after a guilt trip from her mother, she asks their new maid Maggie to teach her how to bake, and together they bake a loaf of bread, which Emily gives to her father because, well, they have a complicated relationship. Later that evening, while lying next to Sue, Emily tells her how trapped she feels living under her father's roof, like the poor people in Pompeii who couldn't escape the erupting volcano. And Sue's all like, "Let me show you what a volcano can do." The parentals are out of town and Emily decides to throw a party. All the cool kids come, including Lavinia's crush Joseph, an uneducated townie, and Jane Humphrey, a popular socialite with a crush on Austen. At Emily's request, lovesick George brings a bottle of opium and everyone gets high. While Emily and George dance together, George proposes for like the 100th time, but Emily tells him he should marry a normal girl, but she still kisses him, then abruptly runs out of the room clutching her stomach. A worried Sue tries to go after her, but Austen decides now is the perfect time to announce their engagement, but the only person who seems to care is socialite Jane. Sue pulls away from Austen and goes after Emily. Socialite Jane then tells a confused Austen what's obvious to everyone except him. Sue and Emily are in love. Meanwhile, Sue is upstairs comforting Emily, whose stomach cramps turned out to be the start of her period. They share a kiss just as Austen barges in. Austen and Emily literally fight over Sue, and Sue's like, you know what? Both of y'all are crazy. I'm out. Sue is now living in Boston, working as a governess for a family, and Emily and Austen aren't taking it very well, especially Emily. She's written Sue countless letters but hasn't received one back. Emily distracts herself by becoming outraged that the town is building a railroad right through the woods near their house and will be chopping down her favorite tree. She seeks out fellow woods lover Henry David Thoreau for help. The author of Walden, the famous meditation on off-the-grid life, turns out to be a self-absorbed fake and tells her he only cares about his woods, and then advises her to never meet her heroes, which is actually pretty solid advice. To further add insult to injury, her father asks her brother Austen to write a poem at the railroad's groundbreaking ceremony. Austen is a terrible poet, and unsurprisingly writes a terrible poem. When her father sees how deeply this hurts Emily, he instructs the railroad builders to build around Emily's favorite tree. George bites the bullet and finally asks Emily's father for her hand in marriage. Edward is not a fan of the idea. He berates George for not being firm enough with Emily, and because George constantly indulges Emily's whims, Edward doesn't think he'll make a suitable husband. But you kinda get the feeling Daddy Dickinson wouldn't approve of anyone marrying Emily because, well, it's complicated. Later, Emily is hosting a meeting of her Shakespeare club, and they're performing Othello, a story about an African general and his white wife. Emily persuades Henry, her father's hired hand, to play Othello for the sake of authenticity. George decides this is the perfect opportunity to demonstrate how stern he can be with Emily and pulls out his old racist card. He tells Emily it's not proper for a black man to be reading Shakespeare with them. Emily promptly kicks him out, telling him she doesn't belong to her father and she will never belong to him. Meanwhile, back in Boston, where Sue's still working as a governess, the father of the family uses his position to force her into having sex with him. Emily is faking an illness so she can have some time to herself to read and write poetry. She sneaks out of her room in search of a book and meets her father's new law clerk, Sexy Ben. Sexy Ben is a fan of literature and poetry, and the two hit it off immediately. He's like the male version of Emily, except, well, less weird. They nerdily recite poetry and prose to one another and go on a secret midnight swim together, and it soon becomes obvious we're witnessing the first stirrings of love. Worried sick that Emily still hasn't gotten better, Mama D calls the doctor, and after examining Emily, he diagnoses her with yellow fever. The Dickinson clan is convinced Emily is on her deathbed, and they all begin to mourn. All except Lavinia. She gets a portrait of herself painted instead. Perhaps feeling a bit guilty about her family's mourning, or maybe just re-energized by Sexy Ben, Emily finishes her poem and makes a miraculous recovery. Not long after, Sue shows up and is upset to find a healthy Emily. It seems Emily's letters exaggerated her non-existent illness and Sue thought she was dying. But Sue forgives her because while she was in Boston, she realized that Emily is the only person in the world that truly loves her. Emily, probably imagining Sexy Ben without his shirt on, is like, "Whoa there, Austen loves you." She then encourages Sue to marry Austen, and then they can live next door to each other and continue being besties with benefits forever.
People, let me tell you about my best friend.
It's election night and Emily's dad is stressed. What was supposed to be an easy win for his party is becoming a vicious dogfight, but Emily couldn't care less about the election. She instead becomes infatuated with the visiting circus, which her father forbids her to go to because forbidding Emily from doing things is what he does best. Emily's hanging out with Sexy Ben when he suggests she enter a local poetry contest. She's like, dude, you know my dad ain't shit. I can't. But the more she thinks about it, the more she wants to, and she comes up with a plan. She convinces Austin to enter her poem using his name, and of course, her poem wins. But it's obvious to everyone who the real author is. The stress of the election causes Edward to lose his shit, and when he confronts Emily about the poem, he slaps her across the face in a fit of rage. Edward wins the election, but after the day's events, it feels like a hollow victory. It's Christmas time, and newly elected Congressman Dickinson is heading to Washington and will be gone for a few months. Things are still tense between father and daughter, and Emily refuses to see him off. After he leaves, everyone begins preparations for the yearly Christmas dinner, but Emily's mother is too depressed by her husband's absence to help, so she stays in bed and gets drunk instead. When the guests arrive, Jane Humphreys' family introduces Louisa May Alcott, most famously known for her novel Little Women. Louisa is all about her coin, and after discovering Emily is a writer, she invites her on a run and advises her to write to market, never get married, and to stay on her hustle. While helping Sue prepare dinner, Emily flirts heavily with Sexy Ben, and Sue's all like, "Girl, what are you doing? Since when do you want to be a housewife?" After dinner is over, Emily retires to her room, only to find Sue waiting for her. Sue reluctantly admits she's jealous of Emily's affection for Ben, but recognizes how selfish that is. It's Christmas morning, and Emily awakens to find a present left by her father. It's a blueprint to build a conservatory that will be attached to the main house for Emily to grow her beloved flowers in. Ben pops up because he forgot his mittens the night before. Emily walks him home and the two share their first kiss, after which Ben immediately coughs. Ben goes into his house, and as Emily's walking away, she sees Death pull up to Ben's door. Sue is getting fitted for her wedding dress, and it's a little snug around the waist for some unknown reason. Ben is still sick as hell, but he and Emily watch the solar eclipse together. Afterward, Ben gives Emily his father's ring, and they both drop the L word. Unfortunately, Ben starts coughing up blood. Emily takes him home and cares for him, but he continues to deteriorate. And although Emily is more agnostic than believer, she falls to her knees and prays outside of Ben's bedroom door. Emily takes a break from her vigil to go on a quick date with Death. She begs Death not to take Ben. He tells Emily she'll never understand him and kicks her out of the carriage. Meanwhile, the other Dickinson sister isn't having a much better time. Lavinia and her crush Joseph are getting closer. So close, in fact, she gives him a nude self-portrait of herself, which he promptly shows to everyone in town because he's an asshole. But instead of hiding in shame, Lavinia takes back her power by giving out copies of her other nude self-portraits to everyone. Because I guess that's how that works. Ben has passed away, and Emily's finding it difficult to leave his grave, even on the day of Austin and Sue's marriage. But for Sue, she finds the strength. She gives Sue a love poem and tells her that as much as she loved Ben, she loves Sue even more. The two of them then run off and do intense friendship type things together.
Let me tell you about my best friend.
Later, when Austin sees Sue's dirty dress and Emily's poem, he loses it and forbids Emily from attending the wedding. George randomly pops up and apologizes for that racist bullshit he pulled at Shakespeare Club and tells Emily he's heading west in the gold rush and invites her to come. She refuses, and although she doesn't say exactly why, it seems clear she's not willing to leave Sue. Emily's dad shows up just in time for the wedding, and upstairs, locked in her room, Emily imagines her own funeral. Death gives her eulogy and keeps calling her a basic bitch that never accomplished anything. Sexy zombie Ben shows up, and turns out he was a little gay for Austin. As Emily's getting buried in her imagination, she screams at the top of her lungs to be let out of her coffin, which of course means she's screaming upstairs in her bedroom and everyone downstairs at the wedding can hear. Afterward, she pulls out all of her poems and begins binding them together with small threads into little booklets. She then tells her father she is a poet and that she will write thousands of poems in this room, and he cannot stop her. And that is it for the recap. Thank you guys so much for watching. And for more videos like this, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next week.